We go. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to NCGR's webinars for members. I'm your host, Jackie Slevin. And our presenters today are Doctors Ralph and Lonnie Diamichis, speaking on the topic of Let's Boot Patriarchy Out of Astrology. Doctors Ralph and Lonnie Diamichis have each been professional astrologers for over 50 years. They specialize in health and location astrology and incorporate multiple disciplines in their consultations. They've offered a book series on both feng shui and herbology. They produced the planetary calendar, started in 1949, and the astrology wine tasting calendar, started in 2023. The research for this book in this seminar is based on work from their work in geomancy and linguistics. They live in Napa, California, and can be reached through planetarycalendar.com. Welcome, Doctors Ralph and Lonnie.
Thank you.
We're so happy to be here, Jackie. Thank you for this opportunity to present this material. This is going to be the first time presenting it from a book that's in progress. So
it'd be helpful.
We're excited.
It's helpful to realize that we've both been astrologers for over 50 years and been members of the, I guess, NCGR for 30 years. And we actually met at the Hindsight Conference in the physics lab at Princeton University. And it's helpful to realize that we're very different than some astrologers in that we work in 3 different fields and have for many years. We're also fairly well-known feng shui practitioners and geomancers. We're also naturopathic physicians and been a professional herbalist for over 50 years. So we deal with geometry not as on lines on a piece of paper, but as actual 3-dimensional spaces, houses, people, the kinesiology of the body, the chemistry of the body, anatomy and physiology. We deal with geometry as a living thing. So it gives us a very different idea of it. And we started realizing about 20 years ago, as we were using the geometry of astrology in our work in feng shui and geomancy, that some things weren't right. Some things were just bent in the wrong direction. And so we started exploring this. And luckily, we had been at Hindsight and we'd done a lot of research. And so we started finding out where the original geometry was. And we've been using that for about 20 years. And then just in the most recent years, we said, okay, well, how did this get so out of whack? And we started researching it. Luckily, I'm a great lover of history, and I've been studying the Greek history. I studied classical Greek in college. Lonnie studied Latin. We're both linguists, and studied Roman history, medieval, and all the way up into modern times. We started tracking down how did it get turned around, and we realized that over the years, from kind of one point, it started going off course and leaning astrology towards men and away from women. And it's kind of one pivotal point, but there were 3 different groups that really affected changing astrology from being very balanced to being very patriarchal. And so that's what the whole talk's about. And it spans about 2,500 years. So even though we do a lot of speaking, we do a lot of TV, I'm actually working from a script today, or we're working from a script today, because to get over 2,500 years within this period of time and make it understandable and memorable for you, we need a script. We can't wing this one.
Well, and I call him Mercury Man because he's easily led down the garden path. Yes. So this will keep him on track. So we hope you enjoy the information.
Yes. So a long time ago in a land far, far away called ancient Egypt, men and women enjoyed equal status. They practiced a very balanced astrology based on the true geometry of the solar system. How did they manage this? It was all about location. The story of Adam and Eve leaving the Garden of Eden describes the time in the Middle East when tribes went from being hunters and gatherers to being shepherds and farmers. The Bible was written by the shepherds, where men were more influential, and it included the first dig at women. They blamed Eve for eating the fruit of knowledge and getting them tossed out of the garden. Ancient writers loved puns and double entendres. This was their way of saying, women developed the knowledge of fruits and how to take the best seeds from the plants and propagate them. They probably became farmers and shepherds due to the dry climate. In the farming communities, women were very influential. They were more important. Now, it's important to realize that this movement out of the garden did not happen all over the planet. When Europeans first arrived in the Americas, over 90% of people were O blood types because they were primarily hunters and gatherers. Among the tribes in Northern California, where we lived, the land was so fertile that the local languages had no words for starvation. Men and women enjoyed equal status, and there was no aristocracy. Chiefs in America were not kings. They were talented orators. Their job was to convince the members of the tribe about the best way forward. Because our Western astrology had its origins in the Middle East among the early farmers, and to a lesser extent, the nomadic shepherds, the people that did the farming and astrology better than anybody else were the Egyptians. They lived in a peaceful, narrow, fertile valley bordering a navigable river that allowed them to produce bountiful harvests of grain and then easily transport them north to the Mediterranean Sea. It made Egypt the breadbasket of the region, and they became wealthy because of their efforts. They were protected from invaders because to the east and the west of the Nile were unpassable deserts. To the south was a fertile, impenetrable jungle. Their only vulnerable direction was to the north at the Nile Delta, where it touched the Mediterranean, and that's where they shipped their goods. But they became so wealthy that for centuries they paid a community of Israeli soldiers to protect the Delta from invaders. As a result, the Egyptians valued farmers over warriors, and that's why Egyptian women and men had equal status. Yeah. Thanks to this geography, the Egyptians farmed and made their astrological calculations in peace for 3,000 years before the Christian era. In all artisan farming areas, women are highly valued for their dexterity, their acute senses of smell, and their acute senses of taste as well. This made the Egyptians very different from the very martial seafarers who they sold their grain to, like the Greeks and the Persians. The Greeks especially celebrated warriors. And remember, our astrology comes through the Greeks, through their filter. Now, the land along the Nile was perfect for astrologers. It's tremendously stable. And as they learned more about geometry, they realized that pyramids made things stable. And so by building pyramids, they made the land increasingly stable. It's one of the most stable places on the planet. The air was also very dry. They only get about 10 inches of rain a year. So the skies were very clear and ideal for celestial observations. Over the millennia, they developed a complex astrology based on geometry that was like their culture and like nature, very balanced between the dynamic and responsive energies, the masculine and the feminine, the solar and the lunar.
And I just wanted to point out, we're showing some of these images that show that even in the things that are left behind from that society, women figure prominently in their art that records their history.
It's interesting when we talk about this, where people would like to say, well, what are your references? What are your literary references? And the problem is that when it comes to the geometry, the place where the references exist is not in any written forms. It's in stone. It's in the geometry. At the port where they did business, where they stole their grain, like every port throughout history, and you'll see it even today in America, most of the astrologers live close to the big ports. There were map makers, navigators, and astrologers. The astrologers found a ready market for their knowledge among the seafarers. But in turn, they also accumulated the stellar lore from all those foreign lands. Their incredible collection of astrological knowledge later became part of the Library of Alexandria. Today, we would actually call the library a university because it's where physicians, astrologers, surveyors, architects, and sculptors would travel to Egypt to study. To give you an idea of the importance of Egyptian astrology, consider this. When Julius Caesar, remember, he traveled to Egypt, he met Cleopatra, he had a child with her, and he brought her back to Rome. She brought her Alexandrian astrologers. Caesar worked with these astrologers to create a new solar calendar to replace Rome's solar lunar calendar, which had nones and eyes. It was based upon the lunations. This Julian calendar that they created is the immediate predecessor with the Gregorian calendar that we're using today. It has very few refinements. The difference is really in the leap days, because the Julian calendar basically said that the year was 365 days, 0.25, and the Gregorian is 365.24, dot, dot, dot. So it's a tiny amount. But the Julian calendar was used up into the 1920s in some places. See, even back then, Julius Caesar knew that the Egyptians were the best astrologers. So you have this tremendous body of knowledge that the Egyptians have gathered over 3,000 years. And then in 2050, the Egyptians burned down the Library of Alexandria and set humanity and the sciences back by at least 1,000 years. The only surviving written records of Egyptian astrology are the 4 books of the temple. And the reason is these were the books that the students would bring home with them on the sailing ships. Now, I don't know about you, but when I started practicing in 1972, I had 4 books. I had my Ephemeris, all from the Rosicrucians. I had my Table of Houses, and I had 2 reference books, which is, compared to the wall of books we have today, it's tiny. But if you had training and you knew a bit about systems, this was really enough. And
you got them from the library at Alexandria, didn't you?
Exactly. Right. Brought them home on the sailing ship. So that was a different life, I think. The greater depths of Egyptian astrology only exist in one form, like I said, in stone. It's in the pyramids. It's in the temples they left behind. What was great was that, remember, the architects and the sculptors traveled to Egypt. They brought it back to their country, and then it got passed down through the stonemasons and the architects through generations. So it went from the Egyptians to the Greeks and the Persians, to the Romans, then to the Arabians, and finally to the cathedral builders of Europe. When you go into cathedrals, if you look at the architecture, you'll notice that there's certain things that looks like fans at the top. That's actually the symbols of the palm trees, the palm fronds from Egyptian architecture. It's been passed down through this history because of the shape of the leaf, which is very close to the Vesica Pisces. The logical astronomy that underlines astrology is there in the stone. I think I was thinking this morning, the first book I found on the pyramids, I found when I was 25 years old. The most obvious example of the astrology in this are the 4 equilateral triangles of the Great Pyramids of Giza. They're equilateral and they're sitting on a 4-sided base. They're a description of the elemental tropicities: fire, earth, air, and water. The base of the pyramid is 4-sided square, and now we get to some of the hidden astrology, some of the hidden geometry astrology. Because in the true geometric system that connects the 7 celestial bodies to the signs, that is based on 4 different triangles. They're not equilateral, they're 4 distinct triangles that are each used 4 times. We're going to cover this towards the end of the talk. Yeah. But that's really the system. You probably won't recognize this geometry because the 3 groups of male astrologers over about 2,300 years broke the system for either politics or money, or usually both. We're going to explain how to restore that system later on in the talk, but this first part is all story. Just so you understand, we first encountered this true geometry about 20 years ago through our study of ancient architecture and our work with geometry and feng shui. Since then, we've used it in our work, and it produces good results consistently. The experience also confirmed for us that there are important parts of popular astrological geometry that are broken. It's created an astrology that's very patriarchal. The good thing is, we know who broke it, and we know how to fix it. Good thing, right?
You got connections.
You got connections.
Right.
Okay. Here we can go. Go to the Parthenon.
I think this is so interesting because this slide just shows the Parthenon, and it was really a temple of Venus.
Yes.
And
Athena.
Athena. And it's all built around this gold statue. Yes. That was really gilded like this.
Yes.
In fact, I'm going to jump ahead for a second and go to this one. We actually visited, there's a creation of the Parthenon in scale in Nashville with the full-size gold goddess.
Yes.
So it's anybody in Nashville, make sure you go see it because it's really remarkable.
Yes. What's important to realize with this is that the Greeks and Romans, the things that they did are still affecting us today. You know, it's not just, as I'll mention later again, that the fact that all of the astrological signs are in Latin. They still affect us today. There's a whole, we're going to go into a whole thing about the zodiac as well and the things, changes that were done there, just to give you a little preview. The first big break in the geometry was made by the Greeks. And what they did is they actually changed the ruling and detriment signs of the moon. And this was really an act of hero worship. And it was aimed at Alexander and Hephaestus. It happened years after they conquered the Persian Empire. This is Alexander the Great and Hephaestus, who was his co-general and his lifetime companion. It also happened years after Alexander was actually crowned the pharaoh of Egypt. Now, these two were devoted to each other, and they actually exemplified what their teacher Aristotle had said was that true love is one soul shared in two bodies. Now, when Hephaestus was killed in battle, Alexander never stopped mourning him, and he actually died 8 months later at the age of, I think, 28 or 31. So they were just devoted to each other. Before this campaign, their little section of Greek was a backwater at the edge of the Persian Empire. By the time they died, and all the conquered countries were being ruled by their Greek generals, Greece had become the cultural center of a trading network that spanned the Mediterranean. This had just changed the world. So the Greek astrologers changed the geometry so the relationship between the sun and the moon would emulate the devoted relationship between these two demigods, Alexander and Hephaestus. Like I said, sometimes it's done for political reasons. And this was the first big change. Now, it may come as a bit of a shock, but the idea that the sun exclusively rules Leo and the moon exclusively rules Cancer is only about 1,500 years old. You go before that, that wasn't true. I remember we were at Hindsight, and Rob Hans saying, oh, and under the Greeks, the sun and the moon both ruled Cancer and Leo. They ruled them equally.
Right.
And that got me thinking, this is what, 30 years ago, got me thinking about it. It took me a long time to figure it out. It's another break in the geometry made by the early Roman Catholic astrologers. Now think about this for a moment. The sun and moon. Oh, you can go to here.
Oh.
The system of the sun ruling Leo and the moon ruling Cancer was done by the early Roman Christian astrologers. We're going to come back to it later. But this was thought up by priests who at the same time were arguing about whether or not women had souls. And the general consensus was they did not. Maybe it's time to restore the geometry to what it's supposed to be and not what these priests thought they would like it to be. Right?
Can we talk about this a little?
Yeah, sure. We can talk about this.
Well, you know, so this is when we talk about the triangles or we talk about the geometry, this is how we describe them in graphic form so that you can see the rulerships or how each planet is connected to each sign. And you know this by the term of the table of dignities. But that was also modified. And some of the terminology that is used in that is sort of derogatory for the feminine, or even calling it masculine and feminine oversimplifies it or overgenderizes it, really. And so we started using the terms of dynamic and responsive. So they're not necessarily connected to masculine and feminine because that just pigeonholes the genders into certain roles.
So in the Egyptian system, the original system that goes, it's there in the stone, the sun and the moon both had two ruling signs that relate to the career, which is what ruling signs relate to. One masculine and one feminine, or one dynamic and one responsive, as well as two what we would call the detriment signs, or medieval astrology called the detriment signs, which relate to the family, also one masculine and one feminine. The problems for the Greeks with this system was that in this system, the sun was loyal to the moon, but the moon was not totally loyal to the sun. The moon had other, what you might call, foreign connections. And this is interesting because if you've ever studied European royalty, this was actually the royal marriage strategy, because what they would do is queens were often chosen from foreign families, and that way they could cement alliances. They would travel from other lands and to try to cement alliances. The other advantage to it is once they had the alliance, the queen would teach the children of the king and queen her language. And so in the future, the alliance would be easier to conduct across the channel or from one country to another because the future rulers spoke the language. Okay, so you could facilitate the treaties. The thing is that because of her other alliance, there was always a little bit of suspicion about the queen.
Right.
About the time. I think one of them, I'm trying to remember which queen it was that was married into the family of France, and she came from Italy. And they were always suspicious about her until she brought Italian cuisine to France. And then they loved her. So there you go.
And all you Taurus moons will relate to that.
Yes, exactly. Now, in the Egyptian arrangement, as you'll see it here, the sun rules Leo and Cancer, right? And the reverse signs, which are the family signs, remember those what they call the ruling signs on the moon triangles. I'm sorry. Yeah, let me move up to that.
Or is it? I'm sorry.
I think the next one is the sun one. There's the sun one. And the sun triangles, we'll go back to that. In the sun triangle, the sun rules Cancer in Leo, and then it's exalted in Aries. And then those are the career signs. That's the public life. On the what they call the detriment, really the family side, then you have Aquarius and Capricorn, and the exaltation is Libra. So these are the two different polarities.
So instead of calling this a debility of some kind, they're either dynamic or responsive relationships. So they're useful either out in the world or within the home life and the personal life. And so instead of characterizing planets in your chart as being, in detriment or fall, it's more supportive for the native to understand that these work in a different way, on a more internalized and more responsive kind of way.
Now, one of the things that this shows, because Cancer is also the sign of the moon, the lights are different. I'm going to go over this again, but the lights are different from the planets because they share light. The moon takes the light from the sun and reflects it. The moon sometimes appears in the sky when the sun is up. It's a sharing of light. So that's why the moon, you find the moon sign in the sun, and the moon also shares a sign with Jupiter. So they're different from the other planets. All through the astrology, we always say, well, the planets and the lights. And a lot of times we mix them together saying, oh, well, they're all the same. No, they're not. The lights are really, they act differently. They are more, I don't want to say mutable, but they're more connected. And when we get into the actual geometry of this, it becomes clear. And also, when you look at these triangles, I'm going to come back to this again. We're going to mention this multiple times. Look at the angles that they're formed. They tell you all about the planet. The sun is what? You have a trine, right? So the trine is big cooperation. You have a square, which is practical issues, and you have a semi-sextile where they're next to each other. That's a symbol of polarity. And that's the sun. The sun is up in the day, at night is dark. Day and night is strong polarity. Big cooperation, practical issues.
Do you want to look at the moon?
Let's go back from the moon.
You want this one or you want the other?
Well, I'll show you this one. This is how we usually show it all together, but it's a little confusing. So let's go to the next one. We split it out between the two. And this is how we actually like to show it. See, the table of dignities was designed to be up and down. Okay, so therefore, the rulers were above. Remember, this was during monarchies. So everything related to how were you going to be related to the monarchy, the hierarchy? How high were you? As you got further down, women who were at the bottom, who ran the family, had no rights. They had no rights. So they were at the bottom. And for men in public life, their family was seen as a vulnerability. They were not seen as a necessarily help, but it was the foundation. So we think in the modern world, where I think probably 80% of astrologers are women, and I would say probably 70 to 80% of our clients are women. Maybe we need to look at this a little differently. Maybe not to put the women towards the bottom. Maybe be a little more balanced, because in America, balancing, as astrologers, we know that an important part with any person we deal with, is balancing between their home life and their public life. What do people come to us and ask for? Love and money, the two sides of the life.
Sometimes it's money and love.
Sometimes it's money and love. But so here we put them side by side. To the left side, and we do that because it's the left side of the body, which is the emotional side of the body, is the moon triangle. It relates to the home. On the right side is the sun triangle. It's the social side of the body. It's why you put your right hand out to say hello. It's your social side. The left side is where you hold a baby head so they hear the beating of your heart. So we put them side by side. They put them in proper polarity. Now, you're going to notice where it says, like in the fall position, and you notice where it says the exalted position, there's a little arrow. That's there because what this was designed to show, and we use the term, instead of fall, we use confidant. Instead of exalted, we use the colleague. We're going to cover this more. It shows that it relates to another planet. It shows a familial relationship with another planet. It's not just whether that sign is strong or weak. And the whole way the table came down to us without instructions, it doesn't tell us that, no, this is meant to show a connection to that planet. There's a relationship like an uncle or a grandfather or a best friend.
And it's not it's not going to be surprising that the moon, we know how changeable the moon is and emotional the moon is. And so most of us are not surprised to look at these relationships described this way in the triangles. They form a yod. It's two quincunxes and a sextile that combines the signs that they rule.
Right. And quincunxes symbolize high intuition, and sextiles represent close cooperation. Well, that's the nature of the responsive personality. And the quincunx is actually physiologically, what it actually describes is the ability to connect between the two different parts of the brain, which is something that women have more connections between the two sides of their brain than most men do. Though highly creative people tend to have high numbers of connections, but it's the ability to go back and forth between the intuitive and the logical very easily. And that's where the quincunx comes up. For years, they always called it a woman's intuition.
Right.
They could look at something that men would just miss and say, oh, well, this is what's going on. So,
in case you need to mark.
Thank you. So try to get back on script a little bit. So like, for instance, in this, for instance, when you're looking at the colleague, okay, now let's cover the signs. Let's cover the signs that the moon relates to first. Go back to the moon.
I'm sorry.
Because it's a little tricky. So the moon, of course, go to the right side, because everyone knows the rulers. We've so focused on the rulers. The moon, of course, there's Cancer, right down the foundation. The exalted sign, of course, is Taurus. The dynamic ruler is Sagittarius, which, of course, is the masculine sign or dynamic sign of Jupiter. Jupiter is the foreign prince. In fact, in Chinese astrology, they call them the foreign prince, or the exalted duke. That it's such a powerful force. Remember, not just that Jupiter is big. Jupiter has a huge moon system, and it has 3 sets of asteroids that travel with it. What are called the Trojan asteroids. It has a big influence on us. You could put all the other planets inside of Jupiter. It's a much more powerful influence. So the moon is connected to that. That's her connection to her foreign family. See how we're talking about here? So that's where the other ones. And when we get to Venus, we're going to see that Venus uses the same triangle. Remember, I said that there's 4 triangles, which used 4 times. Here we have 2 of them. The other 2 places we find the same triangle, this yod, is Venus. Now,
and you can look at these. Explain.
Oh yeah, and then on the other side, of course, this is the family side. You have the sun, the moon's receptive or responsive position, its detriment in Capricorn. Its other one, of course, it's opposite Sagittarius. It's Gemini. Okay, and the Capricorn moon is very strong in a family life. People don't realize, I mean, we normally see the Capricorn moon as being weak moon. It's not a weak moon. In the home life, it creates structure. It's essentially the moon of the grandmother who kind of makes the rules. The Gemini moon is because they're so good with kids. People with Gemini moons are tremendously good with children, which in the home life matters. And then this is interesting.
And communication, of course.
And communication, teaching, children. During COVID, how many children had so many problems with speech because they were only around their parents and they weren't around other children to learn language. It's, mothers teach their children to talk. That's where they learn from. The fall position, this has always gotten the worst hit, you might say, of being called the fall. It's the confidant. It's martial. It's the martial sign. It's, remember, it's a sign of Scorpio. It's within the family life, someone you can turn to who will do things for you that need to be done. When a woman's having a baby, who stands by their side, who will be there for you.
Well, and it's called the fall because the moon is not considered a martial planet. So when you give it a sign that is ruled by Mars, you think, oh, it can't work correctly in that way. But it's not true. It just has to work in a different way and in a different environment.
And also look at it from the point of view of a man. Okay, man in a public position, right? He views the family as a detriment. He sees it as a vulnerability. Who is the confidant to his wife? His wife's sister, his wife's best friend. Does his wife's sister or best friend know all of his secrets, all of his faults? Yes. This is why it was called the fall. This was really a point of vulnerability. The other vulnerability would have been his mistress. The person who's hidden away, who knows all of his secrets. It's a vulnerability. So from a man's point of view, a man in public life who wanted to show off to the king, this was considered his weakest point. But within life, this is the person who shows up when you need them.
And we're going to go through the other planets and their triangles as well. But I just want to mention that, who hasn't worked with a client who knows a little bit about astrology and says, oh, I have Mercury in Sagittarius, I know it's really screwed. Well, that's not necessarily true. Right. In fact, it's not true at all. So
exactly. So now to get back to the script a little bit, to put the sun and moon in alignment with Alexander and Hephaestus, the Greek astrologers changed the triangle of the moon. Okay. In the new triangle, the moon also ruled Leo and Cancer. I think you have to go to the next one. Okay.
This is the sun.
Oh, then the one after that. There's one more after that. Okay, and this was the new one.
Okay.
So where instead of having a yod, having that beautiful triangle, they changed it so the moon would also rule Leo and Cancer. It had its detriments in Aquarius and Capricorn. Okay, but the difference now was that the difference between the sun and the moon now was only in the exalted and fall signs. Okay, so they changed the triangle. And the reason was that they wanted the sun and the moon to be equally loyal to each other, the way that Alexander and Hephaestus had been loyal to each other right unto death, right?
Well, and you see that it limited the moon to the signs of the zodiac that in a natural chart would be the inner world. Again, right. Calling that just limiting its influence, or the other side having them limited to the externalized world.
And look at this triangle. It's made up of a square, practical accomplishments, a sextile, close cooperation, and a semi-sextile polarity. Remember, Alexander and Hephaestus often described each other as being interchangeable. They were polarities to each other. And they wanted the astrology of the sun and the moon to reflect these two demigods, which is kind of a remarkable thing to realize. You could change stuff like this. Who knew you could do that kind of stuff, right?
A little bit of ego, huh?
A little bit of ego. But at the time, these were, Alexander and Hephaestus changed the world. So,
and they changed astrology.
And they changed astrology in the process. Remember, at this point, basically, they kind of, Hephaestus as a man usurped the role of women. And also in the region where Hephaestus and Greek women had no rights, but in the region where Hephaestus and Alexander came from, the love between men was considered the highest form. Love between warriors, agape, was considered the highest form of love. Love with women was, required. So later, when we explain the true geometry of the rulerships and detriments, the exaltations and fall, we're going to give them these more modern names. We're going to keep using these more modern names. But these medieval titles come in from a time when there were monarchies. Remember that there were monarchies. Women had no rights. So when you see the term, fall, you see detriment, you see ruler. Remember that.
Yes, the changing to the different terminology does take quite some adjustment.
Yeah.
Because we've all learned them and used them for so many years. But
now it's important to realize that while the Greeks followed this particular approach where, the highest level was between warriors, this was not universal. There were many societies where women were warriors alongside the men. The Huns, when the Huns invaded the Eastern Empire, about a third of the warriors were women. Among Genghis Khan's soldiers, about a third of them were women. And in those societies, women had very equal rights. Now, while the broken geometry of the moon was a small change, okay, this is a small change. It's just one little triangle, of 8. It's like making an error in navigation at the beginning of a journey. Over time and distance, it's going to take you further and further off course. By the time it got to the Romans, it was really pretty skewed far toward patriarchal astrology. Now, while Greece was a trading network, Rome was a crossroad, okay? And they took business very seriously. They were a lot like New York City. They were an important crossroad. As they became wealthier, they hired Greek tutors for their children. They hired Greek physicians who were also trained astrologers. At that time, most astrologers were physicians. They hired trained astrologers, for, their, just like we do today. They hired Greek stewards to run their households. And they also hired Greek philosophers to argue and drink with, which is a helpful thing to have. They record a lot of that, arguing and drinking with philosophers among the Romans. As a result, the aristocratic Romans grew up speaking Greek with their peers. Latin was spoken with the common people. Greek culture was a big influence on the Romans. Even Julius Caesar, who was born in the sun sign of Cancer, idolized Alexander, who was also born in Cancer. Caesar often compared his own efforts to his hero, who he learned about from his Greek tutors. When Caesar was murdered in the Forum, and he saw Brutus, who was the son of his longtime lover, Livia, coming at him with a knife, Caesar didn't say, et tu, Brute, you too, Brutus. He said, qui vesi, Bruto, you too, Brutus, in Greek, not Latin. And then he died. That's how influential the Greeks were in Rome. Now, remember, the Romans now have learned the Greek astrology with this broken lunar triangle. But then they made it even more patriarchal. While the Egyptians were like these peaceful, wealthy farmers and the world came to them, the Greeks made their fortune by sailing the sea. They set up outposts, including in southern Italy, that they called Onitri, the land of wine. The Romans became wealthy by being a crossroad on the old salt trail. Roma was the spot where the travelers on the western coastal road could safely ford the Tiber River. The river was where barges brought produce south from the fertile heart of central Italy. Now, Egyptian astrology, look at this timeline. Egyptian astrology was very spiritually balanced. The Greeks, due to their seafaring nature, aspired to spirituality, but it was very patriarchal because it was based on warriors. The Romans were using the skewed astrology as they grew into an empire. And wherever they spread to, the roles of women were increasingly restricted. Remember, that first error is now taking us further and further off course.
Right.
For instance, the Greek name for the goddess of love, Aphrodite, means sea foam, because sailors would watch the foam float up from the waters and form rainbows as it disappeared in mist. So their higher form of love, agape, relates to transcendent love. The Roman name for the goddess, Venus, comes from the word for desire. They were a land-bound, earthy people. The Greeks would have related Venus, the Roman Venus, to Eros, who was the earthbound son of Aphrodite. Now, both the goddess and her son, Aphrodite and Eros, appeared in the pre-Christian zodiac. but they were written out by the early Christian astrologers and replaced by the two fish that carry them.
So the symbol of Pisces was
Yes.
very changed.
Yes.
We'll talk about that more later.
Now, the Greeks get the credit for inventing astrology because Christian priests burned down the library, right? So most of the records only go back as far as the works written in Greek. 250 years after the library goes up in smoke, Emperor Constantine, a famous astrologer, moves the empire to Constantinople.
Sorry, I keep flipping the chart.
That's okay. Constantinople. And he made Christianity the official religion of the empire. Or that's how the story goes. Okay. In truth, what he did is he merged the Roman religion, of which he was the Pontifex Maximus, the head priest, with the Christian Trinity, which included a male God, his male son, and the genderless Holy Ghost. And this creation became the Holy Roman Catholic Church and returns quite a bit of the Roman religion even today, including an all-male priesthood. Now, something I just should mention that among theologians for centuries, they've argued about who the Holy Ghost is. Who's the Holy Ghost? And it was finally concluded that it was the one who could move back and forth between the spiritual world and the physical world. Well, in mythology, that's Mercury. That was the gift of Mercury that could go back and forth. So basically, they turned Mercury into the Holy Ghost. Now, under Constantine's patronage and guidance, the Christian astrologer priests made two changes that affected the Western world for centuries. Okay? This is what we mentioned before. They decided that the sun would only rule Leo, so it would only be connected to male energies. The moon, symbolic of women, would no longer have any influence over the sun or men. The moon would only rule Cancer and only be connected to feminine signs. So they obliterated their planetary triangles and they rigidly defined the roles of men and women. I mean, think about that today in the Roman Catholic Church today. There's no women priests. In fact, the only women in the Vatican basically serve the priests that are there as servants. The system we use today, and we mentioned it, was created by priests who were debating whether or not women had souls. So really, it's not the best system. Now, this is kind of ironic because it was Helena, Constantine's mother, who convinced him to adopt Christianity. But we see this in the separation in Jewish temples and Islamic mosques. Women and men must pray in certain separate sections of the building.
Right.
They built a fence. Why did Constantine and his priests do this? What was the possible reason, right? Why? Money and power, of course. Money and power. At that time, the wealthiest Roman temples were dedicated to the goddesses. And you think about it. Why do people want to seek help from the divine? Love and money, Taurus and Libra, right? So the largest temple on the Roman Forum was dedicated to Venus in her two forms. There were actually two separate doors to two separate statues, wealth and love. The only way the emperor and the priests could get their hands on that donations was by persecuting the priestesses and destroying those temples. Then all the donations would come into the churches, which were being paid for by the empire. Remember, he paid to build the temples. He told the priests, "We will not tax you." Though originally the priests were expected to marry and have sons who could take over as their heirs. That got changed later on. And all of this is under the control of the emperor, who is the Pontifex Maximus. One of the first emperor who was a Pontifex Maximus was Julius Caesar, who was Pontifex Maximus before he became emperor. Now, to accomplish this, yes, you could go to the zodiac, please.
Yeah.
Okay. Go back up one, please. This is the change. No triangles. Do we see any triangles? No, they got rid of the triangles. This is bizarre because within, every philosophical system, every theosophical system, there's always triangles. And it actually comes from nature. It comes from the design of the body. It comes from actually the nutrients we eat. Every nutrient we eat is composed of three major components. Usually 2 alkaline and 1 acid, or 2 acid and 1 alkaline. There's no food that's just made up of one or the other. Even table salt actually has an acid component combined with the alkaline. It's always a balance of 2 to 1.
On a cellular level, every cell has 3 layers,
Exactly.
A carbohydrate layer, a fat layer, and a protein layer.
Exactly.
So there's 3s throughout nature.
Yeah, and basically the Roman priest said, we don't need no stinking triangles. We're going to go to this very simple system. Okay. And when you know the correct triangles, it starts to make sense. Like, for instance, the sun being ruled by Cancer.
That's 60 degrees.
Oh,
There's an error on that slide. It says 30 degrees. It should be 60 degrees. We all know that the sextile is 60 degrees.
Fire the graphic artist. Okay. Okay. Then the other change, it's really important because, for instance, the sun in Cancer is so strong. And people don't take that into account. And we're going to talk about that again. We come back to stuff multiple times because none of us get stuff in the first try. But the sun in Cancer is so strong, but also that idea that the moon also rules, rules Sagittarius. If you've known people with Sagittarian moons, it's a very positive sign. It's a very positive position. It's a position that's flexible because it's a mutable sign, and it's optimistic. So it has that flexibility that's necessary in the moon, but it's responsive. And it's just and normally we don't see it as an especially unique sign, but if you've known a lot of people with that position, it really stands out. So it's the advantage of being an astrologer for 50 years. We've simply seen so many charts and seen so many people. You do notice when certain patterns will show up. Now, to accomplish this big change, this wasn't the only change they did. They actually made even a bigger change. And then you can go to the zodiac.
Well, and I'm a big fan of doing the walk around the zodiac as a teaching tool, and so Ralph is going to explain why the original icons were changed, and of course it was again based on logic and observation.
Right. What they did was the Romans and the Roman priest changed the symbols of the zodiac. Okay, and it's important to realize that the zodiac. I mean, we, as astrologers, that's one of the first things we learn. Yes, I mean, Linda Goodman's sun signs. It's one of the first things we learn. It's humanity's oldest teaching tool. It's up there in the sky. It's something that it's the blackboard on the sky that every teacher could use. It's used all over the planet this way. But when you change the symbols of the zodiac, you change how the culture sees itself. The Roman Catholic astrologers selected new symbols for the zodiac, which who knew you could do that, right? And because if we can do that, I have some ideas about things we could change, okay? So they chose what they thought would support the empire's brand. Remember, at this point, the empire is huge. They also chose symbols that would support the new religion, okay? And it would put women and priestesses down. Remember, they wanted that money. They wanted that power. And to do this, they changed or reframed all the feminine signs except one, okay? They also upgraded several masculine signs that I think they felt needed some toughening up. So consider this. The stamp of Rome is still on our zodiac. And not just because all those names are in Latin, it's still on our zodiac. Now, as we go around this, keep in mind that the original zodiac was created by the Egyptians, and it was about the activities that tribal communities do in the course of a year in their proper time, which includes herding animals, gathering food, tending plants, and hunting. The changes the Romans made were political, which I'm sure none of you know anything about politics, but still. It was political. Okay. So let's at the start of the springtime with Aries. Okay. Before the Romans changed the first time into the aggressive ram, the original symbol, yes, please. The original symbol was the newborn lamb. Okay. Part of this is the fact that part of animal husbandry and taking wild animals to as making them domesticated is when they would hunt. The adults would be killed, but they would find the babies. They would bring the babies back to their camp and then raise them around humans. It's like, for instance, even I heard a story recently where the one had found a newborn fox. They brought the fox back. As long as they brought it back before the fox's eyes opened, they would think of them, the human, as their mother. And that's how they domesticated animals. But they thought of them as the newborn lamb, because that's when the lambs are born, in the early spring. Also, even among the Christians, John the Baptist called Jesus, who was born in Aries, the Lamb of God. Okay? Why did they change it to the ram? Because when the Roman armies would go around the world and they would arrive at a country, they arrive at a city, and they'd have the gates closed, they would say, we're here to do business. And if they wouldn't open the gates up, what they would do is they go down, they would chop down a tree, and on the end, they would attach a big bronze head in the shape of a ram's, with the ram's horn, their battering ram, and they would break in the door. So by changing it to the ram, it was a symbol of Roman power. It was basically a thing that when we come to do business, the army shows up, open the gates up, don't make us cut down the tree. And that's why they changed it. It was a symbol of the Roman legions. Okay? Now, the next one is the one all astrologers have wondered about for centuries.
I just wanted to quickly mention the lamb was not a specific gender, but the ram, of course, is male.
Right. Well, it's also because in animal husbandry, it's the males that are used for meat. The females are always kept. We live in farm country. We know we've learned a little bit being city kids. Now, the next one, how did the cow become a bull? This is a question astrologers about. Why is a feminine sign a bull? Okay. And the proper name would have been for the cow in Latin is bovis. Well, this is kind of interesting because on the eve, each year, 2 new consuls would come to office in Rome. It was the highest office. And on the eve before they took office, each of them would sacrifice a pure white bull because it was the symbol of male virility and power. And then after the bull was sacrificed and the bull was dragged away by the priests, then the two, he and his best friend, his exalted one, his colleague, would stand back to back, usually in the forum, and watch the sky all night for signs. And that would tell them a great deal about the upcoming year. So basically, they changed it to a bull because the bull was the symbol of the consuls, right? Of the 2 consuls who were sacrificing the bull. Which brings us to the next sign.
Well, so does that mean I have a bovis moon?
Yes, it was actually the calf. And it's because that's when the calves were born. Remember, this is all agriculture. This is when the calves were born,
right?
You know, in the springtime. Remember, this is agricultural. It's all about the cycle,
and observation,
the cycle of farming. And what they did too is, you know, lots of things happened in those seasons, but they recognized that the people born at that time had certain qualities. And so what they did was they chose as the symbols what they felt represented that time best. And for Taurus, of course, as we know with Taurus, the people with the moon in Taurus and the sun in Taurus have beautiful voices. Moo. This one always gets me. The original symbol for this were 2 kids, 2 baby goats, because mama goats have twins. They always have twins, almost always. How did it get changed into 2 boys? Okay. That was because of Rome again. Remember Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome's twin boys. So this was a symbol of Rome. Also the twin consuls who came to office every year. There was always a senior consul and a junior consul, even though they actually had identical duties. So basically, these were the 2 consuls. These were the twins who were sacrificing the bull next door. So these first 3 symbols, the lamb, the calf, the baby kids, which are an agricultural symbol, have now been turned into political propaganda for Rome, right? I mean, that's a big change, but remember, this is Rome. They were great at messaging. So this went all over the empire. It reinforced the symbol of Rome. And now you've just added 2 men to the zodiac, young men, but 2 men to the zodiac. Because in the original zodiac, there were 2 women and 2 men. Now we're up to 4 men. So we've moved up.
Well, and so if we're using terms dynamic and responsive instead of masculine and feminine, even though Gemini is considered a masculine sign, it's a dynamic sign. And that doesn't have to be genderized.
Right, exactly. And once again, remember, it was 2 kids before. It was a masculine sign. They upgraded it to 2 guys. It was a nice upgrade. They're going to upgrade Sagittarius too, by the way. Now, this is the only one they left alone. The crab was the only one they left alone. No, they had the other male ones they left alone. But with the 2 Sagittarius.
The female one.
The female, yeah, the female ones were always, all of them were changed except this one. Why did they leave this one alone? And why is the crab the symbol for the mother? This doesn't seem, I mean, mothers are not really crabby. The reason for it was that this is during the summer solstice. These are the warmest days of the year. The crab is actually a sign of feminine leadership, okay? The women of the tribe, the men would be out hunting during these long days, okay? The men would go out hunting. The women of the tribe would move the tribe and all the children down to the seashore or to the edge of the river. And they would go where it was cool. We still do it today. I grew up in New Jersey. Every summer we'd go down to the shore. You go down to the shore, and what do you do when you go there? You hunt along the beach for crabs. You hunt along the beach for seafood. It's an area that because it's beaches, because it's wide or open, you could see predators from a distance. So the women as a group could watch out for the children. If they came close, they could grab rocks, they could grab sand and throw it at the animals and protect the children. For the children, it was wonderful because they could go out into the water and hunt crabs. The biggest danger is a little pinch on your toe or your fingers. And then they would gather the crabs, they would gather driftwood, and they would make a fire, and they'd have a wonderful crab fest, right? And for many children, if you grew up in New Jersey, a lot of Italian-American families, a lot of our favorite memories are going down to the shore with our family and eating. And this was a sign of feminine leadership. And it was the one feminine symbol they left alone. I think it was because it was such an important symbol to so many about their very early childhood. That's my only assumption because they changed everything else among the feminine signs. Now, the lion, this one they didn't change. This is actually one of the oldest symbols. And the reason for this was that, why the lion? During the long parts of the summer, lions are nocturnal, big cats. All the big cats, they're nocturnal. They're basically, they like to hunt at night. During the summertime, they get very sluggish, okay? So they'll go through after easier game, and they'll tend to hunt during the day more. During the summertime, the tribes were outside. The mothers and children, the most vulnerable of the tribe, would be outside of the village for longer periods of time. So they'd be in more danger. So at this time of the year, the hunters would go out hunting the lions. Because the lions were more sluggish, they were easier game. You know, they could find them sleeping many times in the shade. So it was a safer time to go hunting them. But as a result, when men would go out, or men and women would go out and hunt, they would wear the lion, if they survived, they would wear the lion skins. And it was a symbol of leadership. It meant they were willing to risk their lives for the weakest, the most vulnerable of the tribe. And this today is one of the symbols we have for leadership, is how kind are you, or how much do you watch out for the weakest among us? And even when the Romans would march, for instance, the best soldier in the legion would wear a lion skin over his shoulders. So that symbol has not changed. This one, oh my gosh.
This is the big one.
This is one of the 2 big ones. Dea Magna, the great goddess. The original symbol for this was called the great goddess of justice. And the scales next door, those were hers. But she was the goddess of justice. She was the goddess of the harvest. When you look at the constellation, in her left hand are the stars of India Mitrix. It's the stars, it's a bunch of grapes. In the right hand she's holding up high, it's called Spica. Now, the Romans said, oh, this is a head of wheat. The reason was that wheat was tremendously important to the Romans. They would buy wheat all over the Mediterranean, because when the legions would march, they'd carry huge amounts of grain with them. So they didn't have to forage, and they could cover huge territory. They marched every place. They didn't like taking boats. The Greeks liked boats, the Romans didn't. So they changed it. But in the original system, it was the great goddess, because this was the time when the women would harvest.
And the wheat, you were talking about the wheat, the spike of wheat was not a spike of wheat, it was
a spike, a knife. When women would work, they would have a sharp piece of stone. In fact, where we live in Napa, right up the valley from us is a large deposit of obsidian. It's volcanic glass. It's the sharpest object on the planet. The native tribes here traded as far south as LA, as far east as Utah. It was so valuable. It's the sharpest object on the planet. But they would hold up a spike. And that when we see people out in the vineyards here, they have grapes in one hand and they have their knife in the other hand. This was when women harvested. Remember, when they moved from the hunter-gatherers to stable groups, stable agricultural societies, wine became tremendously important. Not just because it makes you feel good, but it's antiseptic. It's nutritious. A major portion of people's nutrition came through this. It was the only potable liquid that you could store. The women were the ones who made the wine. Remember Lucille Ball stomping the grapes? It was always the women who made the wine all the way back in history. And so this was the time when the women would bring the food in and would be able to get the tribe through the winter time.
So the businesswoman, the one with
Yes.
all the knowledge about, how to feed the world,
Yes.
became this helpless virgin.
Exactly. And that's what they did. They took this powerful woman, this goddess, Magna Dea, the great goddess, and changed her into the virgin, the helpless virgin. Now they could also use this, of course, later on they use this, initially they didn't even talk about the Virgin Mary. When they first set up the Catholic Church, they didn't talk about the Virgin Mary. It was all male. It was an all male priesthood. It was all male, a male God, a male son, generalized Holy Ghost. Later on, they had a very hard time getting women to come into the church. So they basically resurrected the whole concept of Mary, the mother of Jesus.
That was based on an older Greek.
It was based on a Roman god, a solar god called Attis. And he was born to a virgin called Nana. Then he actually got into a bad love affair and he died. And then he was resurrected by Zeus on December 25th. So they basically took that over and made Christmas out of that. For the early Christians, actually, the important holiday was always Easter, because that was supposed to be the birth of Jesus. And you calculate that by going to the first full moon after the spring equinox, and then going to the first Sunday after that, because that was about when Jesus was born. And when they had the Council of Nicaea, where they decided all this stuff in like 500 AD, that was the first thing they decided. What was the date of Easter? So
the Virgo energy is still associated with being a servant.
Yes.
Or not in charge of your own destiny, a worker.
And part of the reason why this was also one of the reasons they chose the symbol of the great goddess, more women tended to be born at this time of year. And women were so important in agricultural societies. Among shepherds, men were more important, but among agricultural societies, women ruled. They're more dexterous. They have a better sense of smell, better sense of taste. They work better as a team. They're more cooperative. So for bringing food in and storing food, and in those kinds of processes, cleanliness is everything. And we tell people in winemaking, 90% of winemaking is washing things. And women were simply better at maintaining the order that was required to do this well. Even among today, there's only about 15% of the winemaking community is women, but they're all up at the top. They're up in like the top 10% of the field among the winemakers. So, and then we go to the scale. Like I said, these were the scales of the grape goddess, because when the grapes came in, even today, when the grapes come in from the vineyard, the first thing they do is they go onto a scale. The truck drives onto a scale.
Well, but this is also very important for contracts, for commerce. Exactly. You bought this much and this is worth this much, and it has to do with the rulership of Libra as contracts and justice and balance, equity.
And the Romans adored their courts. They thought their courts were the best thing in the world. They were very important. So this was also the best time of the year to have weddings, because it was after the harvest had come in. So they had enough food for the banquet, and they had enough resources to help the young couple get started. The two most popular times were always were June and October. Right. But if they had babies, if they got married in June, or they got married in Libra, there was more of a tendency for them to have twins, which was always interesting. And then we get to the next big one. This one was even, I think, more insidious than the Virgo, which it's hysterical. As I'm born in Virgo, Lonnie's born in Scorpio, so we take these two real personally. Okay, the original symbol was Aquila, the eagle. Okay, it's a water sign that they picked the scorpion, which is a dry creature. Okay. this is as dramatic as what they did to Virgo, but more insidious. The original symbol, Mars, was Mars Aquila, was also the eagle, but also related to all of the winged raptors. There were as many temples in Rome dedicated to Bellona, the female goddess of war, as there was practically to Mars. The eagle was their symbol because all the winged raptors, including the hawks and vultures, were the sacred animals of Mars. Aquila was a perfect fit because the female eagles are larger than the males. They're more dominant than the males, and they control the interior design of the nest. Okay. Aquila, remember, has a great sense of geometry, and people born in this time of year tend to have a very strong sense of three-dimensional geometry. Now, also, the eagles and these other winged raptors can be found in the snowy mountains. Remember, snow and ice, that's fixed water. They're a fixed water sign, and they make their homes up among the ice. Now, vultures, amazingly, they can fly as high as 30,000 feet above the earth. It's really extraordinary. Now, people born in the sun are very strategic. They're very patient. They're very powerful, but in a very responsive way. And they don't shy away from difficult choices. Now, why was this chosen at that time? Because this is the season when the tribal shepherds slaughter marginal animals, right? The ones that are not going to survive the winter. And what they would do is they would watch for the great birds circling to lead them to the weakest of the herds. In Italy, eagles nest in the snow-capped mountains, the land of ice and snow. As an aside, this is interesting. There's two other symbols that are often connected to the sign. One is the serpent, but that's because it relates to Kundalini energy at the base of the spine. But, feminine power is much more complex than that. Also, the phoenix has oftentimes been connected to the sign, the Scorpio, but because it rises from the ashes. But this actually is a different story. It relates to the inferior conjunction of Venus and the sun. Okay, it's the myth of Persephone, because how she traveled into Hades to rescue her beloved. This is actually an analogy of childbirth, when mothers, they travel to the edge of death to bring their beloved to life. So they're not really the symbol of Aquila. Now, using Aquila for this feminine sign for the priest was a problem. And that's because the eagle was the symbol of the Roman legions. Remember, it was led by the best soldier, and he had his lion skin. He carried a staff with the symbol of an eagle on top. Why would they pick the scorpion? I mean, come on, that's a long leap. Common poisonous dry weather creature for a water sign. Because at the time in Rome, there were a group of aristocratic women who had been poisoning their husbands and taking control of their estates. So like the scorpions, after they had sex, they killed their mates. And the priests obviously had a very poor opinion of women. So that's how it got stuck. I really think anyone who has the sun at this part of the sky has to start using Aquila or the eagle. And let's get rid of the little acronid, okay?
Arachnid.
Arachnid, that one too. We'll get rid of that one too.
Arachnid.
Yes.
Arachnid.
Okay.
I don't even know what you said.
Do you have any comment about that, my dear?
I like the eagle.
You like the eagle?
I like the eagle.
Okay, good. Now, Sagittarius the archer, this is interesting how this got evolved. The original symbol was simply an archer or an arrow, Sagitta.
Sagitta was the name of the sign.
Right.
Before it became Sagittarius.
Right. So the arrow, okay. Why did they put the center there, okay? A couple hundred years before this all happened, they started changing stuff. The Huns had invaded Eastern Europe, and about a third of their warriors were women, and they shot arrows from compact bows while riding small horses, okay? And realized that they brought great things to Europe. They brought this compact bow. They also brought along the stirrup. They brought along exotic herbs and medicines. They brought foreign languages to that part of the world. Hungary, for instance, the language of Hungary is unlike anything else. Hungarian is unlike anything else in Europe. It's unique, and it was brought from a foreign land. You remember how we think of Sagittarius as being related to foreign lands, to benefits, to things that improve our lives. Well, that was this invasion of the Huns. By turning Sagitta into a centaur and turning them into a myth, the Romans could avoid acknowledging the invaders' success, which would have shown up Rome's own vulnerability. Oh, I think so, yes. This is the season of the archer. This is when they go out hunting and all the leaves have fallen. So this was the time of when archers would go hunting. So that's why it was always this time of year. It's a masculine sign because the men were a little stronger. They could shoot a little farther. The next one, which is, we think of, Capricorn, was always seen as a mythical creature, okay? Because apparently the Egyptians knew about large goat-like mammals with a beard and a tail that like to climb rocks. Here, they're called seals in our mythical land of California. We see them along the coast all the time. You see them down to San Francisco. This was the seal. Maybe they were unwilling, the Romans were unwilling to ascribe to the feminine personality, the sense of ambition and responsibility that you find in the sign. More than likely because there's very few seals in the Mediterranean. There's only one breed that shows up there, the monk seal, not very many of them. This time of year, though, and the Egyptians, remember, they were dealing with people.
I'm sorry, they do look a little bit like a goat face.
Oh, yes.
On flippers.
Oh, yes.
This one is a pretty one. We picked a pretty one for you, but
yes, the males especially look like them. Yeah.
Right.
This was remember the Egyptians knew about many cultures. This was the time of year when the seal hunters could go hunting because the ice was frozen over. You could only hunt them from the ice side. So this was seal hunting ice. And those teeth, they are the sharpest, longest teeth of any mammal, and they were very precious for scribes. And the Egyptians, of course, were great record keepers.
Well, and the reason you could only hunt them from the ice is because if you hunted them in the water, they're so dense with their body fat, they just sink to the bottom. So They wouldn't be able to catch their prey.
Exactly. Now, Aquarius, they didn't change. And the thing about Aquarius, they always say why the water bearer? It's because this is the time of year when plants are dormant. It's at the most dormant time is at the new moon in Aquarius. That's when the Chinese New Year is, and that's after that when seeds will sprout. And this is the time of year when primarily the men would fix the irrigation systems. In Asia, that's when they drain the rice ponds and they repair the rice ponds. That's the traditional time. That's why it was the irrigators. And then we go on to Aphrodite and Eros, which was Pisces. In the system, okay, in the original horoscope, okay, if you look at the constellation, one fish is swimming north and one fish was swimming south. In the ancient world, the upper section was called the Great Lady of the Zodiac. That was Aphrodite. Below was Eros. It's the difference between above transcendent love and below physical love. And they're swimming in opposite directions, but they're connected by a long string. This is symbolic of, among other things, astral projection. When you're sleeping and you go out of your body, you're connected by a long line. Your physical body is below, but your spirit is ascending. It's also symbolic of the end of life when the spirit ascends and the line breaks. And Pisces, of course, is the end of the cycle. It also, because it was the fishes and it was about the waters, it was assigned to people at that time of year. The plants on the land are dormant, but along the water, there's still food. So once again, the tribe, like during Cancer, would move down to the water to find food. And it was Aphrodite. So in this original zodiac, there were two men, right? There was the archer and the irrigator, and two women, the great goddess Magnedia of Virgo and Aphrodite. After they made the changes, there was now one humble virgin, right? And four men, Gemini, one of which is a horse. But four men. What's interesting about this, if you watch any event, watch NCIS, for instance, one of the most popular shows out there, the whole series, it's always what? 3 to 4 men and one unattached woman. How much do you think it's changed?
We're 10 minutes.
Okay.
For Q&A. So let's go to the outer planets real quick.
The outer planets. Now, when we first learned astrology, Mark Edmund Jones and Dane Ruddier, we're reading books that were written after the 1930s. In the 1930s, you had a really interesting period of time, and a group of astrologers started deciding that, with the discovery of Pluto in 1930, that they should reassign the signs. They should give them away to the planets, okay? And sounds like a great idea, especially because during the war, and they had read about this, the Iranian astrologers were already giving away signs to hypothetical planets. So they figured, why not us? And remember, at this period of time, 1930, they've gone to the First World War, okay? right at the tail end of the First World War was the Spanish flu, which was as bad as COVID, except instead of hitting the boomers, it hit the young people, wiped out a huge population around the world, okay? So they go through that. 1930, only 5 years before, Hubble has confirmed that there's other galaxies. So they're living in a very small world. 10 years before, 1920, American women finally get the vote. It's only 10 years in 1930, okay? It was going to be till 1945 before women became official members of the American military. It was actually the day before Uranus went into Gemini. And, we have Uranus about to go into Gemini again. So they're in a very tumultuous time. And, Pluto's discovered in January or in February. 6 months later, the Great Depression starts, okay? And Pluto's discovered. Now, we have these great pictures of Pluto. We have great pictures of these planets. To them, it was a tiny little dot on a photographic plate. They knew nothing about it. These folks, they're going back and forth. They're all writers and journal owners. They're going back and forth about this stuff. And the way they decided which signs should go to where was with mythology and psychics. Mythology and psychics.
And I remember early on, Lee Lehman, it might have been at Project Hindsight, talking about how those rulerships of those outer planets were just really badly thought out and not really appropriate. It was around that same time that we went back to using the ancient rulerships.
Right, and also realize, today, like for instance, we do the planetary calendar. She mentioned that we're the publishers of the planetary calendar, and so we do a lot of forecasts. We do a tremendous number of forecasts. Well, when we do a forecast, like for instance, in the coming year, Uranus is going to enter Gemini, Pluto's going to enter, or Neptune's going to enter Aries. So what we do is we bring up the charts for the last times that happened. And we look back historically, then we go to Wikipedia and we look it up and search it. They had none of these tools. They had none of the tools that we consider normal today to do any type of analytical idea of what the planet's doing. They basically just were spitballing it. And the thing that really shows how much the patriarchy that was started by the Greeks brought everything off course, that they were so patriarchal, their whole system was so tilted that they take the sign of feminine power, Aquila, which has been turned into the scorpion, and they send it where? To the farthest reaches of the solar system, the land of eternal dark, where basically the sun would look like a relatively large star. They assign that. Then they take the symbol so now Mars, which was both masculine and feminine before, is now 100% masculine, right? They go to Jupiter, they take Jupiter's feminine sign and send it out to another dot, right? And then, of course, they made Uranus, they gave Uranus Aquarius because everyone's least favorite planet typically is Saturn. So they left that one being feminine. So it really tilted it to one side. You could really see this tilt in their personalities of what they accepted as the defined role of men and the defined role of women. The thing about it is that if you look at the triangles, and I don't think we're going to have time to go through them, but if you contact us through planetarycalendar.com, we will send you the math and realize.
Took the words out of my mouth.
We will send you the math, and you may have problems with this. We had problems with it someplace along the way because we were taught different things. We were taught differently. We were taught the rulerships related to these outer planets. It's hard to give that up, but you have to look at the math, and we will send you the math. And when you try the math for yourself on your own charts, on family charts, you see how it works, like we've seen for the past 20 years. Then we can have a discussion.
And so, famous last words. I mentioned to Jackie in the beginning that we weren't in running over. We weren't in danger of running over. And of course, Mercury's retrograde, and so was listening to me. So I want to make sure that we have some time for questions and answers after. But we can also send you, this is the table of dignities that I found that has the representation of the outer planets and who they are purported to rule as well. We're going to go through these. These are all the planetary triangles that we can give you that.
Yes.
And then this one is our planet, I can't even see the
our table defines roles.
Designated roles of and we included Ceres here because Ceres has closer influence mathematically than Pluto does on our. So it's using our terms: the dynamic, the receptive, the exalted, the dynamic family, the receptive family, and the fall, which would have been we call the confidant. And we're happy to look at those. But these come from the triangles that we've described. And if you would like to look at these triangles planet by planet, we're happy to send you the diagrams of them. Shoot us an email through our website, and we're happy to do that.
And one more final thing, of course, the Virgos out there and the Scorpios out there, the great goddesses and the Aquilas, the eagles, probably love us at this point. The other thing that should be realized is that when they gave away the signs, if you look at the 6 signs of Mars and you look at the 6 signs of Jupiter, Mars and Jupiter each have 4 feminine signs and 2 masculine signs. Mars and Jupiter are dominant feminine. They're not dominant masculine. We think of them as masculine, but they're actually dominant feminine. Mercury is dominant masculine. Saturn is dominant masculine. The Sun is dominant masculine, but Mars, Jupiter, Venus, and the Moon are dominant feminine. More than likely, Ceres, because there was a planet where Ceres was at one time, and if you go back to the ancient astrological lore, there are stories about it, was probably dominant masculine. When it bumped into Jupiter, it left that big red spot on its face, and a major portion of it fell into the Sun. But it was designed to be balanced, and we went a little bit out of balance someplace. But Mars and Jupiter are both meant to be masculine or feminine planets, and we think of them as masculine. And as you know, as we've come now into the time of women, you're seeing how many important feminine athletes there are. It really starts standing out. So sorry we couldn't go into more. Like I said, we're trying to cram 2,500 years into 90 minutes. It's not that the easiest thing to do.
We hope you've gotten some resolve about adding the feminine back into these charts and looking at them in a little different way. Try it out with your clients or the charts that you look at and see how you feel about it. And we are so happy to answer questions.
And the book is underway.
Reclaiming Astrology from the Patriarchy. And you can contact us at our website, spaceandtime.com or planetarycalendar.com.
So not sure if we have time for some questions.